Howard Marks of Oak Tree Capital just published his latest memo called The Winds of Change. Now, anytime this man publishes a memo, I always drop what I'm doing, I print it out and read it, because he's great at asking the right questions and developing frameworks. He's not very prescriptive like you'll see a lot of people. You'll see a lot of people claiming to be oracles and say, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. No, he does a great job of framing issues and allowing you to really think about them on a deep level. And those of you who are familiar with the show and listened during deep COVID, during the pandemic, we relied on Howard Marks' thinking, a lot of his memos during that time to understand what the fook was going on. Now, a lot of how I think about preparing for these shows and just develop my mindset is there's endless information out there, but the hard part is finding the right thinkers, finding the right people to follow, and sift through the BS, because the greatest thinkers in the world are just a click away thanks to the power of the internet. So I focus a lot of time on finding the right thinkers and then following them. Howard Marks is one of them, and let's dive into his memo. So he gives a bunch of, I'll go through just what we're going to cover. He gives some history, he gives some facts, touches on how business and investing, businesses have changed and how investing has changed since he's been around the block. How old is he? He's about 70 years old, but he's been around the block. Maybe he's not that. He doesn't look that old. I don't know how old he is, but he's been around the block. I mean, he looks 50, but then he was saying in here 50, 70 years, so I don't know. Anyway, he talks about inflation, deflation. He talks about democracy in America, which is very... He's got some great points there, and I think there's some really troubling things there, so that we'll riff on. He talks about the role of the Fed. He talks about China, my personal favorite, how boomers have fucked us. So it's a good, solid, beautifully, well thought out memo, 16-page memo. I encourage you to take a look at it. Winds of Change. I would subscribe on Oak Tree Capital. They'll drop that in your inbox as soon as he releases it. That's how I found out about it. So I'm just going to go through some of these things. It's really pretty much just a read along. I'll give some of my opinions here, but I really believe that he is one of these thinkers that I think a lot of people should be paying attention to, because I think he does a phenomenal job of allowing us to think through these issues, giving us frameworks, and really not being very prescriptive, but really just asking the right questions. So. He opened up with one fact that I found very interesting. Economic resurgence that we're currently in the U.S., especially in the U.S. It began in Q3 2020 is when we started bouncing back. Is when the economy started bouncing back. And Q3 2020 was the greatest quarterly GDP gain in U.S. history, which is crazy. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it. We shut everything down. And then we came roaring back, so it makes sense that the gain would be a lot, because we were coming off basically flat-footed, and then just exploded out of the block. So, but that's I think there's been a lot of superlatives thrown around during this time, and I think it's important to kind of hold space for the ones that are just super interesting. I think I always like a good factoid like that. So let's talk about his investing. He talks about how in the 1970s, he talks about the rate of change today. So he says the rate of change today he literally says, things are changing every day so much faster than they ever did. And he talks about how in 1970 was really not that different than 1950. I think a lot of people would take issue with that. But if you look at the difference between 2020 and 2000 today, it's unbelievable. Fucking... how powerful the internet is. We all have supercomputers in our pocket. The way politics are in America, the way all these new technologies coming on the scene. It's really a crazy rapid change. And he says this: between 1950 and 1970, whether you're in 1950 or 1970, you still got your news and entertainment, broadcast TV and radio, gas-powered cars, calculations on paper. You were doing calculations on paper. There's no calculators. Composed documents on typewriters. Wrote letters and made phone calls. And got in primarily got your info from books. Now, and of course newspapers. I don't think he called that out, but that's what we call it. There's no calculators, no internet, no PC, no cell phone, no email. A lot of the way we conduct ourselves today didn't exist. And imagine if things were about the same as they were today as they were in 2001. It's just kind of interesting. It's an interesting thing to think about. So he talks about how in the 1960s there was an emergence of growth investing. This was called the Nifty 50. the 50 hottest companies in the U.S. And he talked about how people. He really does a good job of always bringing up. He always brings up history because he takes the thinking that was prevalent at the time and puts it in the context of today. And I think that's really helpful to. It's really helpful to frame thinking in a historical context. So he talks about how there were the emergence of these growth companies, your Kodaks, your IBMs, your Xerox, your JBM, those types of companies, and people invested in them and thought they were not going anywhere. They said these companies are entrenched. No, I'm sure not everyone thought this, but they said these companies are entrenched. These will be here for centuries to come, and boom, call it what it is. And he talked about how if you invested in the Nifty 50 in 1 5-year period, if you invested, which I assume was at basically the top, and then 5 years later, you'd basically have no money. They were trading. A lot of these companies were trading at 90x price to earnings multiple. So, which means based on their earnings, the price of their share was trading much higher than that, which I think is an interesting. It just highlights how different the time was. I think you look at the top 50 companies today. I don't think anyone would say that in 10 years. I bet half of them are not the top 50 companies anymore, and maybe even half of them we haven't even been started yet. I think that's very possible. And the rate of change, which I think is a very good thing. Dynamism is super important. New technologies coming out, new businesses. This is a healthy sign. This is a healthy sign of where. Our country, well, really the world, where it stands with business creation, technology creation, and we'll get into more of that. But I think it's a good thing. I think if you look at classic, a lot of people talk about how the S&P 500, many of those companies, the average lifespan of a company in the S&P 500 is something like 10 years. Now, this is because they either go bankrupt or they get bought or something like that, but it just shows you the amount of dynamism in the S&P 500. So so the top 500 companies in the United States. That's something to look at, because if failure is a healthy part of the market system, and if you have entrenched players that are just there and it's pretty static, that's not a good sign. You can also relate that to the billionaires, the top, Forbes 400, the amount of switching in the United States between how long people stay in that list. It changes quite a lot. Now, these aren't people that were born into wealth. They're billionaires now. They're still billionaires when they die. They'll pass it on to their kids. They're billionaires. That's not how it works in the U.S. Other countries, it's a lot more static. That's one of the beautiful things in the American system. If you want to stay on that billionaire list, if you want to even get on the list, you have to create something super valuable. You have to create a business that's super valuable, and you got to stay on top and beat your competition. So it's an interesting thing to think about. Now, he also talks about how businesses are changing. So as tech and information play a larger role, he says labor becomes less necessary. Now, Naval Ravikant, who's a very well-known investor, thinker, he talks about this notion of infinite leverage. We live in an age of infinite leverage, which means it's not about how hard you work. It's not about putting the hours in. It's not about how much labor you have. It's in a world of infinite leverage, where technology, where code, specifically software, can do the job of millions of people. Literally a well-written app with 10 engineers, famously WhatsApp, I think they had 50 engineers. They were serving, millions and millions of users. I think over 1 billion users when they had 50 users, 50 developers, which is an interesting. It's unfathomable the type of companies that can be created today, how small they can be, and serve that many users, and how profitable they can be. It's like nothing we've ever seen. It does not compare at all to the companies of old, which is a very interesting thing. And he talks about how this is a scary thing, because I think a lot of the reason that these large tech companies get a lot of shit is because politicians, they don't provide a lot of jobs for the constituents of politicians. They just don't. I think Amazon's one exception. They have, I think they employ over 1 million people. I think they hired 400,000 during the pandemic. They've hired a shit ton of people. They have physical space all over the country, and warehouse space, and jobs all over the place. But your Googles, your Apples, your fucking Netflix, your Microsoft, they just don't, well, Microsoft's not really in the heat, but they just don't provide that many jobs relative to how huge they are, and I think that causes a problem. And he talks about how when farming became more mechanized, that replaced a lot of jobs. And where do those people that kind of lower skilled labor go? They went to other factories, creating automobiles and household goods. So there became there was an option for them. Now, he thinks this time is different, and similar to what Andrew Yang says. And I'm always afraid of and this is where I'll give my own opinion here, because I think he's great, but I disagree with him here a little bit, because Andrew Yang talks about this too. He says automation is going to destroy all the jobs, and what are we going to do? Well, we're actually not seeing that at all. There's actually a labor crunch right now, so I think it's a little too soon to start worrying about that. I think we can cross that bridge when it comes, but we should not be prescriptive with medication before there's an issue, right? We shouldn't start saying, oh, we need to move to UBI immediately because there's no jobs. No, there's plenty of demand for jobs. Now, the issue is, I think there's 11.7 million open jobs and 7 million unemployed people. Somewhere there's far more, 50% more, something like that, jobs available than there are unemployed people. And unemployed means people looking for work. Now, so we're just not seeing now the issue. We think, what's that gap? Well, a lot of these the jobs that are in demand, people might not be trained or skilled enough to get some of these jobs, so that's why they're not filling them, or they're not, they might not have the right education. So that is something to think about there. So he talks about how some people, like I just said, UBI, universal basic income, people look for the governments to make payments to offset the lack of jobs for people, which is not an issue yet. He says, the government, he talks about how some people, he doesn't want this, but he says some people say, we need to just redistribute wealth and give people money. And he talks about the opioid crisis, and how a lot of that was tearing through communities where white men were losing their jobs and they were feeling inadequate, so they turned to drugs. So he doesn't see, Howard Marks points out, he doesn't see money as fixing that. He thinks there's a lot of value you get from having a job, or not necessarily having a job, but, well, I get he is saying this, but having a job and feeling like you put in a good day's work and feeling that you added value to the world and feeling like you're a valuable person for doing that. Now, he thinks that's a very, very valuable thing. And from personal experience, I think that makes a lot of sense. People like working towards a goal, and they like doing something and like seeing their shit at the end of the day and be like, they kick their feet up and be like, damn, I did that today. That doesn't get solved by giving everyone free money. Now, there have been some UBI experiments. I think it was Nixon in the U.S. actually that was actually talking about doing some UBI stuff, and at least some of the early stuff that I've seen, people haven't just quit. They don't just sit on their ass. They get the money. They keep working, but then they get supplemental income. I think it's not one or the other. I mean, if you're going to do UBI, it's UBI giving everyone $10 a month is very different than giving everyone $5,000 a month. So it's a gradient here. So I think that'll be. I mean, we'll fucking see, but right now we're just not fucking seeing the all these jobs being destroyed. But to Howard Marks' point, maybe the jobs are getting destroyed and the people aren't filling these jobs because they don't have the right education and they don't have the right skills. So that's tough. And also, a lot of the jobs in the energy sector, which employs a shit ton of people, renewable energy just doesn't provide that many jobs relative to your oil, your gas, your coal. Solar panels and wind, it just doesn't. And you can understand, you can kind of intuit why that makes sense. You put the solar panels up, yeah, there's some maintenance, and wind turbines have more maintenance, but it's just not that much. Now, there's all the jobs that go into creating those things, sure, creating the materials, building them first, but the ongoing maintenance of them and running of them, it just doesn't create that many jobs. So we'll see. I think there's some valid points here. Again, he does a good job of framing things. Okay, let's talk about inflation, deflation, and I got to speed this up, or else it's going to be a 50-minute podcast here. So he talks about how inflation right now, he kind of levels it. He thinks people are thinking, okay, is it Fed policy that's causing this? The amount of money printing, the amount of spending? Well, actually, the money printing. He's talking about the Fed. Or is it the supply chain and labor market bottlenecks that is causing an increase in prices? And we don't really know. And one of the things he iterates a lot. A lot of people I follow on Twitter, especially in the crypto world, are like, "Oh, the Fed did this. Boom, that's why inflation is happening." Maybe, but there's also a labor shortage and a supply chain thing. You don't think that has a little bit to do with it? It probably does. Again, the question is how much do each of those three things? How much are they actually contributing to this? So he doesn't know. He doesn't claim to know. But those are the kind of the three pillars that he's thinking about. Hell, it could be something. It's probably not something else besides one of these three. Okay, so and he talks about how he quotes Cathie Wood actually. Who Cathie Wood is a famous investor. She hit the scene pretty hard because her whole thesis was she was looking at the public equity markets and said, look, there's all this cool shit happening in the private equity markets, all these cool startups and people taking big bets, but the public equity in the stock market. Public stock market, people weren't taking big bets. People weren't taking bets on public companies doing epic things. And she's like, we got to take that startup thinking, that kind of early stage company thinking, and let's bring money to that. Let's bring capital to those public equities. So she has a bunch of, her company ARC has a bunch of ETFs you can invest in different sectors like biotech, automation, things like that. And famously, she's a big Tesla bull, and many of her funds have done well riding on the success of Tesla. But she talks about, he quoted an interview with her where she's talking about how the deflationary, she thinks, yes, there's inflation right now, sure, you can't doubt that. But she thinks the big long-term issue is going to be deflation due to technology, because technology makes everything cheaper. And and people say, oh, well, is deflation bad if all the prices go down? Well, actually, one of the interesting things with deflation, and it's a complicated issue, but I know one of the things that I've read about is that deflation, if prices are going down, it encourages you to not spend, because the dollar you have in your bank account now will buy you more if you wait. And that has knock-on effects with the economy. People aren't going to spend, they're going to save more. And that's not going to be good for the economy. It's not going to stimulate it. And also debt. So if you have debt, $100 of debt, if there's massive deflation, that $1 of debt actually becomes more burdensome. So it hurts people that are in debt. Whereas inflation, if you have a shit ton of debt, and inflation prints, if you have $100 in debt and boom, the value of the dollar is just shrinking, then it's easier to pay off your debt. Something to think about. So Cathie Wood talks about how there were three major things in the when was this? The 1800s. The telephone, electricity, and automobile were three big pieces of tech driving a lot of change. She says today we have 5: DNA sequencing, robotics, energy storage, AI, and blockchain. So I think it's interesting that energy storage she calls out, not just energy. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff with nuclear fusion, and also just nuclear fission. Just that's the standard nuclear energy. So it's interesting she didn't call that out, but I think she's a big, and so am I. She's a big bull on just technology. She sees all the shit that's going on, and frankly, just if you're following the right publications and looking at what's going on, people are inventing the shit out of shit. It's a crazy, crazy, crazy time to be alive. And she thinks that's going to have a deflationary effect over the long term, because shit's just going to get cheaper. Because when technology does its job, things get cheaper. And then you add economies of scale to that. It's a flywheel effect. Okay. Let's talk about another part of this. Democracy in America. So he talked about how, and we've talked a lot about on this show, about the destruction of gatekeepers in the United States. The destruction of gatekeepers. How in the old days we had the Walter Cronkites. You had your ABC, your CBS, your NBC. Everyone was kind of watching the same. There weren't that many channels. Paul Graham has an epic essay on this. Everyone's watching the same shit. Everyone had the same shared facts. That's no longer the case. Everyone's a creator. There's no gatekeepers, and as such, we're all operating on different kind of lenses and different set of facts. And he talked about how this is putting strain on our system. And he gives the point that a presidential candidate could win. So now he's talking about more of the nitty gritty here. A presidential candidate could win by one vote in 39 of the least populated states and DC. So receiving 47 million out of 93 million, if all registered voters voted, they would win the presidency even if another candidate got 100% of the vote of 120 million in 11 most populous states. So in our system, in other words, a president can win with just 22% of the vote. Now, we haven't seen this. Obviously, this is an edge case and it's an extreme, but it's kind of crazy that our system allows for that. And he talks about how historically presidents have won with a large percentage of popular vote. Like if they won the electoral, they won the popular vote. 60% in some cases, I think, was it LBJ or something? Won with 60% of the vote. Now, in the last 8 elections, that's decreased. With 2 of those elections, the popular vote winner was not the Electoral College winner, and he thinks this is going to increase, meaning we're going to see more of this, and it's going to put strain on our system because if the citizens do not believe in the outcome of election or do not believe that the democratic process is representing them, that is super unhealthy for the stability of a country. So I'm going to quote him here because I think this is one of the most chilling quotes in the entire memo. Clustering and gerrymandering increase the already substantial influence of one party or the other in many states, and state legislatures' control over elections opens the door for possible shenanigans. I think this is one area that is not discussed enough. Gerrymandering, it's fucking crazy. It does determine the outcome. This isn't just the state level. These are the people that are representing you in the federal government. Your House of Reps. Now, obviously, it affects the state level too, but it affects the representatives that are affecting policy at the federal level. And he goes on. Secretary of State and membership on boards of elections have historically been nonpartisan positions and pretty boring. Increasingly, appointment or election can put partisan officials in charge of the election process. Both new laws and new political norms seem to have opened the door for legislators and election officials to behave in ways that were previously unthinkable. Ultimately, there's nothing to keep state legislatures from appointing states of electors who will vote for the dominant party's nominee regardless of the popular vote in their states. Serious potential threats to our democracy exist, and no one can say what the future holds in this regard. Famously, Arizona has implemented this. There's at their state legislature level. Imagine they count the votes. It goes toward the Democratic candidate in 2024, or the election would be in 2023. And the state legislature decides, now we'll give our electoral votes toward the Republican candidate. Imagine how horrible of a situation that would be. What would that do to our country? Nobody knows. And I guess it's not illegal. It's not illegal for them to pass this. I don't think the federal government's not stepping in. I think they can totally do this, which is scary. And he talks about how previously, I read the quote. Things that would be unthinkable are now as people grab power. And let me just say, this is the Republican side. He doesn't want to say it. It's like, bro, this is the Republican Party doing this. There is absolutely no evidence of voter fraud in the election between Biden and Trump. And that's without all this stuff. So imagine if this law was passed in Arizona and the Republicans there said, fuck it, let's send it. Interesting. He also talks about how the Speaker of the House, and I've never really thought about this, and he's not a political pundit, so I don't know how much of this is a thing, but he said the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate have a huge sway on what legislatures even discuss. So 2 individuals have a big sway over what is discussed in their respective chambers, over what legislature that will even be considered, which I think is interesting. He says, is that democratic? It's interesting. He also talks about, and I haven't thought of this, but of how doubtful a third party the chance of a third party taking control. Now, you need 270 votes to win the presidency. And if no one gets that, the election's decided by the House of Reps, with each state having 1 vote regardless of the population. Now, you think those the states are going to nominate a third party? Fuck no. There's going to be Dems and Republicans in the House. It's just not going to happen. Okay. Here we go. He moves on to the boomers. So I'm going to read this. So the 71.2 million members of the baby boom generation, people born between roughly 1946 and 1964, are triple the 23 million members of the silent generation that preceded them and 10% more than the 65 million Gen Xers that followed. The magnitude of the boomers' votes and financial resources have given them enormous political influence over the last 40 years. The result has been extensive deficit spending on things that boomers want and a failure to modify benefit programs that need fixing, all at the expense of future generations. He says, and by the way, today's generations have been happy to consume... excuse me. So it's an interesting... So this deficit spending and I think largely people say, oh, we're at 20 trillion in debt. I think the number isn't what's important. It doesn't matter how many dollars in debt we are. What matters is a percent of GDP. And as a percent of GDP, it used to be like 50%, then it was 60 and 70. Now it's crept up to like 130% as a percent of GDP. Because anytime someone says the number, 30 trillion in debt. And Morgan Housel talks a lot about this. Oh, that's such a big number. Well, what does it mean? Well, typically, when we take on, when our debt grows, we grow out of it. Now, if our economy does better and grows, that will be a smaller percent of our GDP, and we can more easily service the debt, and it's not a big deal. But now that's become an increasing percent of the GDP. It is a big number too, but more scary, it's an increasing percent of the GDP. Put it this way: if the debt was 100 billion trillion, but it was 1% of our GDP, well, who gives a shit? And if the debt was, a billion, but it was 5,000% of our GDP, that would be worse. It's not the absolute number. Okay, it's the percent of the GDP that you really got to focus on. Don't let these fucking headlines sway you. And look at it. Look at the percent of the GDP. That's the most important thing. And he also says something interesting. He has a quote. And by the way, today's generations have been happy to consume an unsustainable share of the Earth's resources to fuel their lifestyles, which is certain to leave future generations with a degraded environment. This is another profound aspect of generational inequity. I'm long technology. I think we'll figure this out. I actually don't think. I think in 100 years, the Earth's going to be in a better position than it is now. Full stop. There's going to be less carbon in the air. I think carbon capture is going to take off. I think in a lot of ways, what you see is as countries get richer, they treat the environment better, and as people get richer, they value the environment more. So if things keep trending, if people keep getting richer, and a lot of these countries these developing countries keep getting richer, that's going to be a good thing. And I think I'm personally I'm an optimist. And I'm not an optimist. I'm an optimist based on the facts, based on the ability for humans to invent themselves out of anything. And we've done a hell of a job, and we need to do more. Climate change is a big issue. Don't get me wrong, but I'm optimistic. Okay. So I want to read this quote because I think it's super interesting. In August 2008, on the way to ending my memo, What Worries Me, I included a passage from the 2004 book Running on Empty by Pete Peterson. For those who aren't in the business world in the 20th century, Pete held important positions in government and co-founded Blackstone with Steve Schwarzman. Here's the quote. While our problems are not yet intractable, both political parties are increasingly incongruable. Now, this was from 2004, remember. They are not facing our problems. They are running from them. They are locked into a politics of denial, distraction, and self-indulgence that can only be overcome if readers like you take back this country from the ideologues and spin doctors of both the left and the right, with faith-driven catechisms that are largely impervious to analysis or evidence and that seem removed from any kind of serious political morality. Both political parties have formed an unholy alliance, an undeclared war on the future, an undeclared war, that is, on our children. From neither party do we hear anything about sacrificing today for a better tomorrow. In some ways, our most formidable challenge may be our leaders' baffling indifference to our fiscal metastasis. And this was written in 2004. Now, it always strikes me, and it worries me that, and part of this is just, there's not that, just the amount of people, I know so many smart people and that just won't even consider going into politics, which is scary. So who are all the fucksticks that end up actually running? Yeah, we need, and a lot of people, will fucking bitch. Hell, I'll bitch about it. Bitch about what's going on with our country. And all the homies in the group chats, everyone's saying it, but no one's fucking running. We need people to run. We need people. There's a dearth of leadership in the world, especially in the United States right now. Common sense fucking leadership. that just takes these issues head on, doesn't try to fucking bait either side, talks frankly about the issues, and has some optimism, has some hope, says, we can do this. We're America. We can do this, but here's how we need to talk about the issue, and here's how we need to solve it. And I'm not gonna fucking bullshit. I'm gonna lean into the things we're doing well. I'm gonna talk. I'm gonna say, things we need to improve. But it's just very few politicians. It's just a lot of them are just. It's like they're trying to get retweets, and I don't know. I'm on Twitter. Maybe it's like Jesus. Are you trying to be an adult? Are you trying to run an agenda? Are you trying to be professional? Are you trying to be a leader? Or are you just trying to get people fired up? Okay, I don't know how you can look yourself in the mirror. It's like, is winning that important? Like, is it that important? Is winning that important if you just don't feel like if you feel like what you're doing? Because I think a lot of these people, you got to be a level of smart to get elected. You can't. You got to be a level of smart. You got to be fucking on your shit. You got to run a campaign. That takes a level of intelligence. So the level of intelligence it requires to do that, you can't tell me a lot of these people are believing the bullshit they're saying to get votes. There's no way. But it's like, is that even worth it? Wouldn't you rather just stick to your guns? Isn't that more fun? And it's not like being a politician is fucking great. It's not like it's a great job. Everyone hates you all the time. Your time is not yours. You have to do bullshit to make yourself and your family and all this other bullshit look happy, and like you got to be a fake thing. That's miserable. That's why they call it public service. It sounds like a nightmare. So why are people not? Why don't you just stick to your guns? Worst case, you lose and get to go kick it, go do something else. It's like, that sounds pretty good. So, one of the, anyway, we'll see. We need people to, run. It's straight up. That's what we need. Okay. Here we go. Role of the Fed. So we talked about the Fed. So the role of the Fed, that's the central bank in the United States. Two goals, and it's on their website. Their goals are to keep unemployment low and to tackle inflation, make sure inflation doesn't explode. Those are their two goals. And he's saying the amount that the Fed is now being responsible, is kind of the responsibility that's being put on them is now they got to keep the stock market up. That was never part of the deal. Now it's, the stock market's down, so we need to fucking flood the system and do purchase bonds and purchase equities and do all this shit. It's crazy. And keep interest rates super low. And interest rates were kept fucking low well before the pandemic, when the economy was literally on fire. They were kept low. And what happens when you keep them low is when shit actually hits the fan, you have less of a response system. They were zero. Interest rates were at zero. Think of interest rates as the value of money, how cheap it is. So if interest rates are zero, money's cheap. It's easy to get. It's easy to invest. It spurs investment. They were brought to zero for the first time in 2008 during the Great Financial Crisis, and they stayed there for a while. And I think it was only in 2017 where they were brought up, and then the market got pissed off, threw a tantrum, as Howard Marks said, dropped. But this is how sustainable is just printing the fucking money? Warren Buffett said something interesting. He said, if we could just print money and just drop interest rates, if that could create actually be the fix, you'd think we would have discovered it a while ago. At the end of the day, you can print all the money you want, you can do all this shit. At the end of the day, the only thing that increases the wealth, the only thing that increases the pie, the only thing that adds life expectancy, the only thing that allows us to do more with less is technology. Everything else is fucking noise. Everything else is noise. Now, you need to have people be able to run solid businesses. You need to have people that know how to manage money, obviously. But at the end of the day, those businesses and those to what end are they managing? To the end of developing businesses that create technology. It's all about technology. So if the technology, and Elon Musk said this, that when it shut down his factory in Fremont, he was saying, if you want the economy, you can't just print money. Like we could, if everything just stopped and we printed money, everything would go to hell. You need to create things. You need to make things. You need to create businesses. You need to create technology. That's the only way that that wealth increase. Wealth doesn't increase if you just print $10,000 for every American and just send that to their bank account. That doesn't fucking do anything. That doesn't raise standards of living. It doesn't create anything. There's no net new there. There's no there. Now it's interesting. Some of the Dems on the radical left, don't worry, I dump on Republicans all the time. I will say the radical left. Some of these people are straight commies. They want to get rid of Jerome Powell because he's not doing enough on climate change. Not doing enough on fucking climate change. The Fed, that is not their fucking job. They have too many responsibilities. Okay, we can't expect that the Fed is... You want to address climate change, how can we increase investment in technologies that are going to actually address that? It's technology stupid. People say it's the economy stupid. It's the technology stupid. Dick Lucas, that's what I'm saying to you right now. That's the only thing that's going to fucking do anything. Now, when the Fed, to allow the United States to run deficit spending, what does the Fed do? The Fed buys, purchases debt from the Treasury. They buy those bonds, those Treasury bills, Treasury bonds. Now, here's a quote here. Well, so also other countries buy it. Other and private individuals can buy the debt from the Treasury, but the Fed is doing it. The Fed is the biggest purchaser right now. And he says, so guess what? The U.S. is still able to issue debt at low interest rates, a ringing endorsement of its creditworthiness from buyers. The lower the interest rate, the lower return for investors, that equates to lower risk. Because if you can raise debt at lower interest rate, that means people are feeling like, okay, I'll probably get my money back, so I don't need as much of a return on my investment. And what do you say? And who's the main buyer supplying that endorsement? The U.S. So it's this cyclical thing that's kind of a sick system. Where's the price discovery from the private markets? Now, listen, this stuff is complicated. We had a fucking crazy pandemic event. I get that. But you just can't keep doing this forever. You can't just keep up the deficit spending and increase the debt of GDP. At some point, we'll just have to keep printing money to service our debt. And what happens if we have runaway? We just keep doing that, and our debt service becomes a large percent of our GDP. That gets dark. That's when you have inflation happen. That's when nations fail. So, okay, let's talk about China for a second. It's interesting because I'm short China. Not financially, I don't short anything, but emotionally, that's where I'm betting. I'm not very optimistic that China will be able to maintain its growth. I'm long freedom. I don't think that you can have a centrally controlled economy, which they do have, free market in pockets, but I just don't think, it's never worked in history. And it's working now. I think they've got a lot of the lower hanging fruit by just copying what the West has done. We've got the lower hanging fruit there. But I'm short China. I don't think they can maintain their growth rate, and they don't have the allies. I think they're doing some shit that yeah. But who knows? But here's what he says, which is interesting. Mine is that the Chinese economy will continue to grow faster than the rest of the world and may well become the largest economy. I believe with time we'll see all the above transitions take place. The process just won't be smooth and free of glitches. So you heard it here first. Howard Marks says he thinks China will be the largest economy. Now, you heard this term, purchase power parity, PPP. China is already bigger than the U.S. In terms of purchase power parity. And purchase power parity is a measure of what does $1 buy you in China versus the U.S. Now, you can buy more in China with the U.S. So than with $1 in the U.S. You can build more, you can buy more food, etc. So using that metric, China's bigger. But using in absolute terms, the U.S. is still a much bigger economy. And then, of course, per capita, it's not even close. Per capita, the wealth of individuals in the United States, it's not even close. What is there, 1 billion people in China? 330 million in the U.S. So it makes sense, all things being equal, that they would pass, and we got 3 times as many people as us, but they still haven't done that. And we'll see. Okay. As we wrap up here, I just thought this was interesting. The term trillions is thrown around a lot. I think it's hilarious. Like trillion, he says, here's his quote. I doubt most people could actually explain what a trillion is. That is, they likely have no idea that it's 1,000 billion or 1,000,000 million. And the scale of a trillion is almost incomprehensible. I was struck 30 to 40 years ago to learn that whereas $1 million is $10 a second for 28 hours, $1 billion is $10 a second for 38 months. Now let's think about a trillion. $10 a second for more than 3,000 years. 28 hours for a million. 38 months for a billion. 3,000 years for a trillion. He says, as I said, almost incomprehensible. Thought that was interesting. So let's wrap it up here. Here's a quote by senior economics consultant Neil Irwin, summed up our situation very well in the New York Times on April 16th, 2020. The world economy is an infinitely complicated web of interconnections. We each have a series of direct economic interrelationships we can see: the stores we buy from, the employer that pays our salary, the bank that gives us a home loan. But once you get 2 or 3 levels out, it's really impossible to know with any confidence how those connections work. In the years ahead, we will learn what happens when that web is torn apart by the pandemic and resultant lockdown, when millions of those links are destroyed all at once, and it opens the possibility of a global economy completely different from the one that has prevailed in recent decades. So I think we're already seeing that. People are leaving their jobs in droves. There's a lot more working from home. I think we're seeing some things change, and a lot of people say it just pulled a lot of things forward 10 years, literally. Working from home wouldn't be nearly as big. It would have probably been this big in 10 years just because technology would have been better. But now people are forced to do it. And guess what? They're forced to do it. Turns out they kind of like it. And he ends, as he always does, in classic Howard Marks fashion. All I have to add, that is my usual observation regarding the future. We'll see. Who knows? You make the biggest mistakes. What's that, Mark Twain? You make the biggest mistakes. It's not the things you don't know. It's the things you just know for goddamn certain. That's when you make the biggest mistakes. Keep an open mind. There's a lot of shit going on, especially in today's world, which is, hold space for it, a lot different than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. Wait But Why, Tim Urban of Wait But Why. I've talked about this on the show. It talks about how the period for your mind to be blown has shrunk. So if you take someone from 1500 and put them in 1600, they'd be like, oh, okay, about the same. 1600, 1700, okay, maybe a little different. 1700, 1800, that's a pretty big leap. 1800, 1900, holy shit. 1900 to 2000, whoa, bro. But that amount is shrinking such that if you take someone from 2000 to 3000 versus 1900 to 2000, 2000 to 3000, we're not going to know. You wouldn't even know what the fuck is going on. That is the rate of change. That's the rate of technological progress. That is the rate of change. And it truly is. You just no one fucking knows. That's why no one knows. That's why I personally like to read a lot of different stuff. I like to just kind of keep my finger on the pulse of this shit, and because who knows? I like to dip my toes in a lot of things because who the fuck knows? I am super interested. I hope we don't blow ourselves up, because I think if we don't, I think we will absolutely be a multiplanetary species, and I think we'll have the means to travel the galaxy and have a bunch of civilizations all over the place. And I think that would be a very good thing, because human consciousness, as far as we know, we're the smartest things in the universe. Maybe we're not, but we got a precious thing here. And I think we need to keep it going. This is insane time to be alive. Hold space for it. And it's tough. Pat yourself on the back. There's a lot of fucking shit going on. And I don't buy the argument. Oh, look, we have everything. Be happy. No. Technology, you have iPhones. No. Shit's hard. Shit's even harder today in a lot of ways. It's also easier in a lot of ways. Material ways, for sure. Now, there's no easier time to be alive, I'd say. But it doesn't mean it's not hard in different ways. It doesn't mean that it's not harder to kind of find value, I think, in a lot of ways. Fewer things you could do back then, fewer options, fewer things you could learn. You woke up, oh, I guess I'll be a blacksmith. Oh, I guess I'll work the farm. Oh, I guess I'll join the family business. Oh, I guess I'll do this. There's a business right down the street, join the factory, boom, boom. Now there's literally an infinite number of possibilities. You have the sum of human knowledge at your fingertips. You can literally learn anything you want if you have a smartphone and an internet connection. You can learn anything you want if you have the time. Now, granted, some of us are time poor. I get that. It doesn't solve everything. But is it a crazy time to be alive? I'm personally paralyzed with the amount of things I could do. It's tough. That's okay. Hold space for it. You got this. Let's try to be optimistic. Let's try not to kill each other. Long technology. Long USA. Long human ingenuity. Long getting along. Long business. Long free market. Long power of the individual. Long freedom. This was fun. This is Dick Lucas. Get this wherever you get your podcast. Just search No Gradient. Apple Podcasts. Leave us a comment, rate. We'd really appreciate that. You can get us on Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Like I said, search No Gradient. Also on YouTube. Also on Twitter, Dick C. Lucas. TikTok, just Dick Lucas. Instagram, Dick C. Lucas as well. Thanks for joining. Really appreciate it. This was fun. Howard Marks, thank you for your wisdom. Always a pleasure. We'll see. That's all we can do. We'll see. God bless.